I moved to the province with $1,600 a month from Social Security, and I already knew going in that most people would tell me I was out of my mind. Not in a dramatic way. Nobody pulled me aside and said, "Don't do it." It was more like raised eyebrows and careful pauses when I brought it up. My daughter Nora was the most honest about it. She sat across from me at the kitchen table one afternoon and just said, "Dad, are you sure about this?" And I could hear what she wasn't saying. She wasn't asking if I was sure about moving. She was asking if I was sure I could actually afford to. That question stuck with me for a long time. The number I kept seeing before I left was around $2,500 a month. That was what most forums and expat groups and YouTube comments said you needed to live comfortably in rural Southeast Asia, specifically in the provinces of the Philippines, away from the big cities. Some said you could squeak by on less, but the way they wrote about it made it sound like a punishment, like you'd be eating nothing but rice and sitting in the dark to make it work. I didn't have $2,500. I had $1,500. That was my Social Security check every month, and that was it. I'd worked in logistics for 31 years, managed warehouses, stayed later than I was supposed to more times than I could count. And when retirement finally came, what I walked away with was $600 a month and a body that was starting to remind me every morning that it had been working hard for a long time. In Indiana, $600 doesn't go very far. My rent alone was eating up more than half of it. Utilities on top of that. Groceries. The occasional trip to the doctor, which even with Medicare meant there were always costs I wasn't expecting. I wasn't struggling in the way that people picture when they hear the word struggling. I had a roof, I had food, but there was this constant low-grade pressure that just never let up. Every month felt like I was doing math all the time. Can I afford this? What if something breaks? What if I get sick? It wore on me in a way that's hard to explain unless you've lived inside it for a while. So I started looking into other options. I don't even remember exactly how I first came across the idea of retiring in the Philippines. I think I was just falling down a rabbit hole one night, reading about cost of living in different countries, and it kept coming up. People living on pensions that wouldn't cover a studio apartment back home and somehow having a house with a garden and going out for meals a few times a week. At first, I thought it was one of those things that sounded good until you actually looked at it closely. So I looked closely. I read everything I could find. I watched videos, read forums, found a few blogs from Americans who had done it years ago and were still writing about it. The more I read, the more it seemed like something that wasn't just possible in theory, but actually being done by real people who weren't wealthy and weren't living some Instagram version of retirement. They were just regular people who had figured out that their money went a lot further somewhere else. But that number kept coming back, $2,500, maybe $2,000 if you were careful. And I had $1,600. I talked to my daughter Nora about it more than once. I talked to my buddy Hank, who I'd known since we were both in our 20s working the same job in Indianapolis. I talked to my younger brother Ted, who thought the whole idea was somewhere between brave and reckless and wasn't sure which one. Everyone who knew me listened and mostly supported me in the way that people do when they can see you've made up your mind, but they're still a little worried. And I appreciated it. I didn't want people to just clap and say great idea without thinking about it seriously. But I also knew that I had done the thinking. The question wasn't whether it made sense. The question was whether $1,600 was enough to actually make it work. What I didn't fully understand then, and what nobody really spells out clearly, is that the amount of money you have is only part of the equation. The other part is how you actually live. And that part I was not yet prepared for. I got my paperwork in order. I arranged to have my Social Security deposited into an account I could access internationally. I looked into what I needed to bring, what I could get there, what the visa situation looked like for someone who wanted to stay longer term. I bought a one-way ticket and a cheap backup flight to Hong Kong about 5 weeks out, just in case things went sideways and I needed an exit. It wasn't part of any real plan. It was just a safety net I put in place because I knew that once I was there, I was mostly on my own, and I didn't want the first hiccup to leave me with no options. The night before I left, Nora came over and we sat on the back porch for a long time without talking much. She brought her youngest, my grandson Oliver, who was asleep in her arms for most of it. At some point she said, "Just take care of yourself, okay?" And I told her I would, and that was more or less the goodbye. The first few days in the province were overwhelming in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not overwhelming in a bad way exactly, just a lot of input all at once. The heat hit me the moment I stepped out of the terminal. It wasn't like summer heat back home. It was thick, and it was constant, and it didn't let up in the evening the way I was used to. The sounds were different. The pace on the roads was different. Even the light felt different, brighter, somehow more direct. I had arranged to stay in a guest house for the first couple of weeks, while I looked for a longer-term place to rent. That part I had planned out. What I hadn't planned for was how much energy it takes just to navigate a new place when you don't know where anything is yet. Finding a decent meal, getting a local SIM card, figuring out how the transportation worked. These things weren't hard exactly, but they took time and attention. And in those first days, I was running on a combination of adrenaline and the strange stretching feeling of being somewhere completely unfamiliar. There's an excitement in those early days that I think people don't talk about honestly enough. Everything is new, and new feels interesting. I was taking walks in the morning and noticing things. The way the market set up and broke down, the noise of tricycles going past, the dogs that seemed to belong to the whole neighborhood rather than any particular house. There was a part of me that kept thinking, I actually did this. I actually got on a plane and came here, and I'm standing in the middle of this place, and it's real. But that feeling starts to fade after a week or two. It has to. Because you can't stay in tourist mode when you're not a tourist. You're not on vacation. You're trying to build a life. And building a life looks a lot less exciting than arriving somewhere new. It looks like figuring out where to buy groceries consistently. It looks like negotiating a lease. It looks like understanding what your actual monthly bills are going to be, and whether they're going to fit inside the money you have coming in. That's when the first month got serious. I found a small house to rent in a quiet part of town. 2 rooms, a kitchen, a decent-sized outdoor area in the back. The rent was reasonable, significantly less than I had been paying for my apartment in Indiana. On paper, that felt like a win. But what I wasn't accounting for were all the costs that come with setting up a new place from scratch. A mattress, basic kitchen things, a fan, and then another fan because the first one wasn't enough. A padlock, extension cords, small things that cost small amounts but added up faster than I expected in that first month. I remember going to the grocery store near my place for the first time and just sort of browsing the way I always did back home. I wasn't thinking carefully about prices. I was just walking the aisles and putting things in my basket that seemed familiar or that I felt like having. And when I got to the register and saw the total, I had one of those moments where you do a quick mental calculation and realize things don't add up the way you assumed they would. Some of the items I had picked up, anything imported, anything packaged that came from overseas, were actually more expensive than what I would have paid at a Kroger in Indiana. Not a little more expensive. Actually more expensive. I was standing there holding my bags thinking about a wedge of cheese I had grabbed without looking at the price, and I started to understand something I had read about but not really internalized. Cheap country doesn't mean everything is cheap. It means some things are cheap and some things are not, and if you keep reaching for the things you're used to from home, your savings disappear just as fast. I didn't panic, but I started paying attention in a way I hadn't been before. The electricity bill came at the end of that first month, and it was the moment that really made me stop and reassess. I had been running an air conditioning unit at night because the heat was something I hadn't figured out how to sleep through yet. I thought I was being conservative about it. I was only running it for a few hours at a time, or that's what I told myself. When the bill came, the number was higher than I had expected. Not catastrophically high, but high enough that when I did the math against the rest of what I had spent that month, I realized I was significantly over what I had planned to spend. I sat with that for a while. That's the part that doesn't get talked about enough in the videos and the forum posts and the blog entries about retiring abroad on a budget. It's not the big expenses that get you. It's the accumulation of small decisions you make every day that feel reasonable in isolation and only reveal themselves as a pattern when you look at the numbers all at once. I was eating out more than I planned, because cooking in an unfamiliar kitchen with unfamiliar ingredients felt like more effort than I had energy for. I was choosing the air-conditioned coffee shop over the cheaper local place because I was tired, and the familiar environment felt like a relief. I was making choices based on comfort rather than cost, and I hadn't even noticed I was doing it. I checked my balance about halfway through that first month, not because I was panicking, but because something felt off. And when I actually looked at where the money had gone, it wasn't terrible. I hadn't blown through everything, but it was lower than I had expected at that point in the month. And that gap between where I expected to be and where I actually was felt significant. That's when it became real. Not in a crisis way, in a reckoning way. I remember sitting at the small table in my kitchen in the late afternoon with my notebook and a pen, going through everything I had spent since I arrived, line by line. And what I found wasn't that $600 was insufficient. What I found was that I was still making the same decisions I had been making in Indiana, just in a different country. I had changed my location, but not my habits, and habits are where the money actually lives. What I needed wasn't a bigger income. What I needed was to actually adjust to where I was instead of trying to recreate where I came from. That sounds simple when you write it down. It took me longer to get there than it should have. The adjustment happened gradually. The first thing I changed was food. I started going to the local market in the morning instead of the grocery store. The market opened early, while it was still cool, and the produce was fresh, and the prices were a fraction of what I had been paying. At first, I didn't know what half the things were. I'd pick something up and have no idea what to do with it. But I started asking. The vendors were patient. An older woman who sold vegetables near the entrance started recognizing me after a few visits and would occasionally hold something out and say, "Try this." I started cooking more, not because I suddenly loved cooking. I never really did, but because it was the most practical thing I could do, and after a while the routine of it became something I didn't mind. I stopped running the AC through the night. That was harder. I won't pretend it wasn't. I bought a better fan and positioned it differently and started leaving certain windows open at specific angles, and slowly I figured out how to sleep in the heat in a way that didn't leave me exhausted. It took a few weeks to adjust, but the difference in my electricity bill the next month was significant enough that I didn't regret it. I started walking more instead of taking tricycles everywhere. That was partly about money and partly about something else. Walking slowed things down in a way that was actually good for me. I noticed more. I started recognizing faces in the neighborhood. The man who ran the small hardware store on the corner nodded at me after the third or fourth time I walked past. A family a few houses down had a dog that barked at everything except me, which I took as a minor victory. By the third month, my spending had settled into something that actually worked. Not comfortably, not extravagantly, but genuinely worked. I had enough for rent and utilities and food, and a little left over for the occasional meal out or a bus trip somewhere new. I wasn't saving much, but I wasn't hemorrhaging money either. And the pressure, that constant low hum of financial stress I had been carrying for years back in Indiana, was mostly gone. There was a morning, sometime around the middle of my fourth month there, when I walked out to the small patio behind my house with a cup of coffee. It was early, before the heat really set in. The light was that soft yellow that only happens right after sunrise. I could hear the neighborhood starting up, a rooster somewhere nearby, a child's voice, the distant sound of a tricycle engine, and I sat there for a long time. I wasn't thinking about my bank balance. I wasn't calculating whether I could afford something. I wasn't running through the mental checklist of bills and expenses and what-ifs that had been my constant background noise for the better part of the last decade. I was just sitting there drinking my coffee while the morning came in around me. That was the moment I understood what I had actually come here looking for. Not lower prices, not an exotic backdrop, just the ability to exist without that constant pressure at the back of my mind. And it was there. It was actually there. I called Nora that afternoon. The connection was good enough to video call, which still surprised me a little every time it worked. She asked how things were going, and I told her honestly that they were going well. She asked if I was eating enough. I told her about the market and the vegetables I had learned to cook, which made her laugh because she said she hadn't seen me cook a meal in years. I told her I was figuring things out. I didn't tell her about the hard first month. I'll tell her eventually. But that afternoon, I just wanted to tell her that I was okay, that the decision had been the right one, not because everything was perfect. It wasn't, but because the math of my life finally made sense for the first time in a long time. My buddy Hank texted me around that same time asking for the real report. Not the social media version, the actual version. And I wrote him a long message that basically said, "The first month is harder than anyone tells you, and cheaper doesn't mean what you think it means. And if you come here expecting everything to just be obviously less expensive the way you imagine, you'll spend money almost as fast as you did at home. But if you actually change how you live, if you eat the food that's grown here, if you stop reaching for the imported stuff, if you give up the AC and learn to sleep with a fan, if you slow down and let the place be what it is instead of trying to make it what you're used to, then yeah, it works. It actually works." Hank wrote back, "You sound like a different person." Maybe I do. I'm not sure I would have put it that way from the inside. From the inside, it just feels like I finally stopped treading water. I've been here for over a year now. I settled in a smaller provincial city that most Americans haven't heard of, which suits me fine. The city is big enough that it has what I need: a decent market, a few places to eat, reliable enough internet that I can talk to Nora and Oliver whenever I want, but small enough that it has a pace I can actually live inside rather than just observe. I know my neighbors now. I know the woman at the vegetable stall who holds things out and says, "Try this." I know which roads flood when it rains hard and which coffee shop stays cool, even in the hottest part of the afternoon. My total spending last month was right around $1,540. Rent is $280. Electricity, now that I've learned to manage it, runs between $45 and $60 depending on the month. Food, and I mean real food, market food, the stuff I cook at home plus maybe 1 or 2 meals out a week, is around $200. Miscellaneous things, transportation, the occasional unforeseen expense takes up the rest. I'm not getting rich. I'm not going on European vacations. But I'm also not lying awake at night doing math. The thing I wish someone had told me before I came is that the adjustment isn't really financial. Or it is, but only on the surface. The real adjustment is learning to live differently than you've lived for 60-something years. And that takes longer than 1 month, and it's harder than it sounds. And there will be a period in the middle where you wonder if you made a mistake. You probably didn't. You probably just haven't adjusted yet. I didn't come here because I had everything figured out. I came here because I had run out of options that made sense back home, and this was the option that, when I looked at it honestly, seemed like it might actually work. And it did. Not the way I imagined it. Better than I imagined it, in some ways. Different than I imagined it, in almost every way. There's a version of this story where $600 a month is a crisis. I've seen that version too, in the forums, in the comments, from people who came here with a budget and no plan for how to actually live inside it. And I'm not here to tell you the money doesn't matter, because it does. You need enough. You need a cushion for emergencies. You need to be realistic about healthcare and about the fact that exchange rates move and your rent will probably go up eventually and nothing stays the same. But there's also a version of this story, the one I'm living, where $1,600 is enough. Not because the Philippines is magic, and not because I've found some secret, but because I did the work of actually changing how I live instead of just changing my zip code. That's the whole thing, really. That's what it comes down to. You can keep living like you did at home, and you'll keep spending like you did at home, and the math won't work any better here than it did there. Or you can let the place actually change you. And if you can do that, if you can sit with the discomfort of not having everything the way it was and let a new normal form around you, then this life is available. It's real and it's available, and it's a lot quieter than the one I left behind. I had my coffee on the patio again this morning. The rooster was there. The light was there. Oliver's picture is on my phone screen, the one Nora sent last week of him asleep in a pile of stuffed animals with his mouth open. Everything is fine.